How do you do? Mr. David J. Bradley feels it would be a little unkind to present this video without just a friendly word of warning. We are about to unfold a most unpleasant tale, a tale of evil deeds and the men who committed them. There will be death, dead bodies, murder, murderers, with strong suggestions of viscera and gore, and perhaps, worst of all, that old bugbear, capitalism. It is one of the strangest tales ever told, made all the more frightening because it is all true. I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you. So if any of you do not wish to subject your nerves to such a strain, now's your chance to. Well, we warned you. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? My limbs now tremble and my eyes swim with the remembrance. But then a resistless and almost frantic impulse urged me forward. I seemed to have lost all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit. It was indeed but a passing trance that only made me feel with renewed acuteness so soon as, the unnatural stimulus ceasing to operate, I had returned to my old habits. I collected bones from charnel houses and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame. Oh heck yes, friends, it's that special time of year again when everything is spooky, the monsters are mashing, and we all stay inside watching scary movies pretending that 2020 isn't happening out there. We're all gonna die. This is the time of year when I go absolutely ham on Frankenstein, buying whatever ridiculous merch I can get a hold of. It's Frankenstein liquid soap. I can't even separate my interests from this hell year. It smells like apples. Part of the foundation of the terror of Frankenstein is the formation of the creature. Victor Frankenstein digging up corpses so that he can cut them up and stitch them together to form a new being. It's a deeply unsettling idea that sends a shiver down my spine. Human bodies being debased so that one closeted gay guy can make himself a boyfriend. It rattled people to their very core, and formed a legacy that's lasted over 200 years and kept my hands happily clean. But where did this idea come from? Prowling around graveyards digging up freshly buried corpses? What was the truth of the matter that might have inspired Mary Shelley into writing this? Well, why don't we distract ourselves from what's going on out there? Novelty,
Frankenstein, soap.
And take a closer look. Part 1. Demand. Oh, this will never come out. Oh, so to be clear, people weren't really stealing bodies because it was something they wanted to do. Well, maybe some people, there's no account for what certain sickos might get up to. But by and large, we're talking about a practical need here. We had surgeons and students who were learning to perform surgery, and to do this, you had to have attended at least 2 dissections. There's no better way to learn about the human anatomy than to see it get chopped up into tiny little pieces. But this does come with a slight issue that you do need the bodies to do it with. You have to understand that for the most part, people did not want their bodies to be dissected. It was considered a shameful thing to have happen to you. You ought to be getting a nice Christian burial, not letting a bunch of blokes pull your body apart to see what your insides look like. So the supply going into the schools was not what it could have been. So where exactly do you get a body from? I mean, if people aren't giving themselves up willingly, then it's not such an easy proposition. There weren't just corpses lying around all over the street. You could hardly hope to be that lucky. You needed a steady supply during term time, and they needed to be fresh. No good trying to teach a bunch of medical students what the inside of a body looks like if the bits have all gone runny. And they couldn't exactly just take anybody that they pleased, wait for someone to die, go into their home and say, "We'll take your granddad off your hands, we're from the company of surgeons." No, if you wanted a body for teaching purposes, there were only certain cadavers that you were permitted to use. The main bulk of the supply was made up of the criminal element. In laws dating all the way back to the 1500s under Henry VIII, the company of barber surgeons were permitted to take the bodies of 4 persons who had been executed for their crimes every year for the purposes of teaching anatomy. Now, this served them pretty well, but 4 bodies can only really go so far when you get right down to it. More were required. Help would come here in the form of further legislation. In 1751, we saw the passing of an Act for Better Preventing the Horrid Crime of Murder, the Murder Act to you. This was an act with a very declarative statement that,
in no case whatsoever, the body of any murderer shall be suffered to be buried.
oh, powerful wording, very clear. Murderers, being a blight on the good common order, were not to be permitted the privilege of a decent burial. There were 2 things that could happen to you after you were executed. Either you would be hanged by chains from a gibbet, decomposing for all to see, a nasty reminder of what will happen to you if you try it, or, what is more relevant to our purposes, you could be handed over to the company of surgeons for dissection. Once they're finished with you, there won't be anything left to bury. Well, there we go. Does that not solve all our problems? I mean, there's usually plenty of murderers about, so they must have had an ample supply of bodies at that point, right? Not right. You no doubt noticed me mentioning the company of surgeons. Well, they were messing it up for everyone. So, for a bit of context here, way back in the day, as well as surgeons, you also had barbers. Now, more than just cutting your hair, barbers would perform basic surgical tasks, such as amputations on soldiers during wartime and the like. After centuries of disputes between these 2 groups, they would formally unionize into the Company of Barber Surgeons in 1540. They were the ones being promised the 4 bodies a year by Henry VIII. This group would stay together until 1745, when the surgeons would break away to form the Company of Surgeons, with increasing pressure being put on the Company of Barbers to stop plying surgical trades altogether. It was the Company of Surgeons who would gain access to the bodies by the Murder Act. They were seen as the primary group under law, and they had the sway to get all the bodies they wanted, which is really why you should unionize. Their claim to the bodies would be further cemented in 1800 when they were granted a royal charter and formed the Royal College of Surgeons, an institution which still stands to this day. But this left other practitioners out in the cold. There were surgeons and students who existed outside of this royally recognised company, and they just couldn't get their hands on the bodies. The law made it clear, it wasn't just that the Royal College had first dibs on the corpses, the bodies had to be seen to be dissected by them with a witness from the Crown. Now, in practice, all this really had to be was that the witness would see them do the first incision upon the delivery of the body, and then leave them to do whatever with it. 9 times out of 10, after this witnessed incision, it would be passed off to the lecturers and students to do whatever they needed to do with it. Something that I do think is worth mentioning is that occasionally, after doing this incision, they would then give the body back to the families if they requested it, so that they could give them a decent burial. Not often, but I think it is worth noting that they did that. Gave away perfectly useful supplies just to be nice. So these other schools, and also individuals who operated out of their front rooms, because that was a thing that happened, who weren't being given bodies by law, had to content themselves with whatever the Royal College would give them if they had a surplus, which was pretty rare given that they only actually had a limited supply themselves, and that's hardly enough, is it? I mean, there's only so many lectures on anatomy you can teach if you're only given the Royal College's leftovers. So we had all these surgeons in need of bodies with no legitimate way to get them. And well, desperate times. Part 2. Supply. If there is a clear and present need for something, then there will almost always be someone who is willing to get it to you for a fee. It's just a truth about the society that we live in. If it is needed, then there is money to be made by being the person who has it. No matter how illicit the substance, people will find a way to get it to you if it means that they can profit off it. So it should come as no surprise at all that people were making bank selling dead bodies. Throughout most of the late 18th and early 19th centuries in the UK, there was this need for bodies, and a certain group of people who were willing to provide them. They were known as the Resurrection Men, or Body Snatchers, or what I will refer to them as the Ressurrectionists. They sold bodies that they acquired to the anatomists so that they could carry out their dissections. It is, of course, how they acquired those bodies that is the really interesting bit. There were a few places that they could get bodies from. They could keep tabs on someone who had recently died and then steal them away before anyone had a chance to bury them. They could bribe the coroner to give them bodies from suicides and accidental deaths. Or, what is probably the most dramatic one, and the one that we're really here to talk about, let's be honest, they could steal bodies right out of their graves. Men would sneak into graveyards in the dead of night, avoiding or bribing the night watchmen, and dig up the graves. They would use wooden shovels, as they made less noise than the metal ones, get as far down as they could, snapped the coffin lid in half, put a rope around the arms of the body and hoisted it out of the grave. From there it was a simple matter to cart it off to wherever it was to be sold for as much as £10 a head for an adult body. Children tended to fetch less as they were sold by the inch. You could make more money in one night of body snatching than you were ever likely to make working any regular position. This was incredibly common in both London and Edinburgh, the two chief centres of anatomical education, as well as in other places where it was easy to ship the bodies long distance like Dublin and Liverpool. At the peak of this, there were somewhere around 200 resurrectionists working in London alone, though only around 10 of those were able to do it full time. But it was clear that this was seen as a well-known and fairly easy way to make money. It wasn't a secret that any of this was going on. Fear over the resurrectionists was widespread. People didn't want this to happen to them or their loved ones, so some people went as far as taking precautions against it. At the most basic, this was just having someone sit in the cemetery watching over the graves, looking out for anyone carrying a shovel. But they got as elaborate as people burying pistols under the ground with tripwires to booby-trap it, as a nasty shock for anyone trying to exhume the grave in question. And some people built cages over the tops of their graves called mort safes, and you can still see some of those in cemeteries in Scotland to this day because they just never removed them. But David, I hear you simp, if it was so well known that they were doing this, why didn't anyone stop it? I mean, why didn't the police do something about this? Well, quite simply because what the resurrectionists were doing was legal. It's a bit more complicated than that, okay, but stealing a body was completely legal. You see, technically a body didn't count as property, so anyone could take it. The stuff that was on a body, that was property. Smart resurrectionists would leave behind any clothes or jewellery and just take the body, and the police couldn't really do anything about it. I say complicated because it actually was illegal to dig into the graves to get to the bodies, desecrating the sepulchres as it was referred to. So if the police found a body that they knew for sure had been disinterred, then you could be arrested and go to prison for a few months. Yes, just a few months. And plus, while they were in there, the anatomists tended to support their families with money. Because you didn't want to lose a good resurrectionist, so you had to support their families, otherwise they might start selling to another doctor, or worse yet, they might tell the police that they know where a bunch of disinterred bodies just happen to have gone. The reputation of the resurrectionists was that of villains. People didn't look kindly on defiling graves, and it's pretty easy to see why. I think it's safe to say that this whole thing was kind of immoral. I mean, the people almost certainly didn't want this to happen to their bodies, and once the anatomists were done with them, there wouldn't really be anything left. It makes sense that people saw this as unnerving and frightening and viewed them as horrible, evil men. But hey, at least they weren't killing anyone, right? Part 3. Production. What a lovely specimen. Okay, so there were these two Irish blokes, William Burke and William Hare, and they both moved to Edinburgh. Independently of each other though, they were from different parts of Ireland and they only met once they were already both in Scotland working on the harvest. Burke was looking for a place to live in Edinburgh so that he could ply his trade as a cobbler. Hare happened to have a room going spare in the boarding house that he ran with his wife Margaret, so the two came to an arrangement and formed a friendship. So in late November 1827, Hare turned to his friend Burke for assistance when one of his lodgers, Donald, died of the dropsy. Now in this circumstance, all you would really have to do is inform the local parish and arrange to have the body buried at their expense, which is what Hare initially did, but then he had the thought of selling the body, and for that he would need Burke's assistance. You see, the arrangements had already been made and the carpenter was coming to fit the body that day. So Burke came up with a simple plan. Once the carpenter had made the coffin and left, they took the body out of the coffin, hid it in one of the beds, and then filled the coffin with tanner's bark to simulate the weight. That no one seemed to notice the sound of the wood sliding around in the coffin as it was taken to be buried probably tells you something about just how common it was for people to be taking bodies back in those days. Burke and Hare went to the medical district of Edinburgh University, looking to find someone to sell their body to. They found themselves talking to the porters of an anatomist called Robert Knox. Knox was a fellow of the Royal Society, and he was working to put together a museum of comparative anatomy as well as lecturing students. So he needed a lot of bodies, and he wasn't really getting that many because most of them were going to Alexander Monroe, who was higher up on the pecking order and had first dibs. So when Knox heard that there were two people looking to sell him a body, he wasn't about to ask questions. So Burke and Hare brought the body to Knox, who bought it off them for the princely sum of £7 10 shillings. Around £800 to £850 today. For Burke and Hare, this was a lot of money and gained very quickly. So it's really no wonder that they saw this as an opportunity. If they could make that much money just by selling a body, then why wouldn't they keep doing that? It's just finding the corpse that's the hard part. They weren't exactly about to just wait around for another body to happen to them. So they decided to take matters into their own hands. There is some confusion over who their first victim was. Burke and Hare each gave contradictory accounts of this later on. It was either Joseph, another one of Hare's lodgers, or Abigail Simpson, a woman from a nearby village. It seems more likely that it was Joseph, given that the killing was done a bit less efficiently, and also the dates are a bit less clear, whereas Burke gave Abigail Simpson's death very specifically as the 12th of February 1828. Plus, it just forms a bit of a better narrative if it was Joseph, so we'll go with that and assume he was the first. Joseph was a lodger in Hare's boarding house. He was old and quite ill, spending most of his time in bed. Hare and his wife Margaret were concerned about this because it was the sort of thing that could get your boarding house a reputation of having the fever. People would hear that someone had got sick and died there, and then they wouldn't want to stay in case they caught the same sickness. So they had a certain motivation for getting rid of this guy quickly and quietly. So Burke sat on his chest while Hare held a pillow down over his face to suffocate him. They took his body to Robert Knox, who bought it off them for £10, which was a heck of a lot of money. So it seems as though they had just figured out their business model. Abigail Simpson, most likely their second victim, more clearly represents what would become their standard operating procedure. She was visiting Edinburgh, where she was found by Hare and his wife, who brought her back to the boarding house and got her very drunk. So drunk that she was sick. So drunk that she couldn't go home. So drunk that she would be better off just taking a lie down and spending the night. Once she was asleep, Burke sat on her chest while Hare clamped his hand over her mouth and nose, suffocating her. This was less risky than the pillow used on Joseph. There were no forensics at the time, and this method, which later became known as burking, left no real trace. This was what they did for the rest of their victims. Lured them back to the boarding house, plied them with alcohol, burked them, and then sold them to Robert Knox for £10 a head. In the year of 1828, they killed 16 people. 3 men, 12 women, and 1 child. They had an effective method of murder and a steady source of income because Robert Knox was not going to ask questions about where the bodies came from, even if they came to him absolutely reeking of alcohol. He was just happy enough to keep on buying them. They carried on in this method until Halloween night 1828, when they found their last victim, Maggie Doherty. Maggie was over from Ireland looking for her son when she ran into Burke, who brought her back to the boarding house, and they did the usual thing, getting her blind drunk and burking her. But the next day, some neighbours who had been aware of Maggie's presence wondered where she'd gone to. Burke, Hare and their partner's answers weren't exactly convincing, so when they'd left to make arrangements, the neighbours searched the rooms and found Maggie's body. The police were called for, and though by the time they arrived the body had already been taken away and sold, they found blood that Maggie had spat up during her suffocation, so Burke and Hare were arrested along with Hare's wife Margaret and Burke's partner Helen MacDougall. With just a little bit of pressure applied, Hare pled King's evidence and turned Burke in. Burke was the only one who was tried for all 16 murders. He was found guilty and hanged on the 18th of January 1829. And well, I'm sure you can guess what happened to his body. Part 4. Legislation. Make no mistake, Burke and Hare were not the first resurrectionists to commit murder to acquire their bodies. We don't know of any specific cases, but I mean, come on now. Their case, however, achieved a certain notoriety. Everyone was talking about Burke and Hare. There were even songs written for the music hall about their villainous deeds. People were more afraid of the resurrectionists than ever. Plus, they inspired a lot of people to follow in their footsteps. In the years immediately following their case, there was a rise in anatomy murderers, or Burkers, as they came to be known. This increase in murders and publicity of the murders led to greater demand for the government to actually do something about this. People were being burked all over the place, including the very high-profile case of Bishop and Williams in 1831. They had stolen somewhere between 500 to 1,000 bodies over a 12-year period, and they got caught after they killed a young Italian boy. Things were starting to get to a fever pitch, and the government finally began to have discussions on the best solution to the issue. Other countries already had legislation preventing this. In places like Germany, France and Austria, anatomists could take bodies that were left unclaimed by the hospitals and all bodies from prisons, and they did not have any resurrectionists there. People digging up graves to steal the bodies and murdering people to sell them to the anatomy schools was a uniquely British problem, and it had reached a point where the government could no longer afford to not take action. There was much public debate over what solutions should be put into place. They needed something that would dissuade the resurrectionists while still providing bodies to the anatomy schools. But where would the bodies come from? They needed a steady supply and a greater amount than what they were getting from the executed murderers. The solution was the Anatomy Act of 1832, and it was just a bit terrible.
It shall be lawful for any executor or other party having lawful possession of the body of any deceased person, and not being an undertaker or other party entrusted with the body for the purpose only of interment, to permit the body of such deceased person to undergo anatomical examination, unless, to the knowledge of such executor or other party, such person shall have expressed his desire, either in writing at any time during his life, or verbally in the presence of 2 or more witnesses during the illness whereof he died, that his body after death might not undergo such examination, or unless the surviving husband or wife, or any other relative of the deceased person, shall require the body to be interred without such examination.
What this means is that any bodies that were taken out of workhouses were fair game for the anatomists to use for their purposes. This provided them with a lot more bodies. But it was no longer a punishment for being a murderer. Instead, it was a punishment for being poor. The workhouses were where they sent poor people with no job or home to work and live. They were stuck in these spaces for their entire lives, and then they lost themselves to it after death. Now, technically, they weren't legally obliged to do this. Your family could come and request your body for interment, and if you made it clear in the presence of 2 witnesses that you did not want this to happen to you, then it wasn't supposed to happen. But here's the thing. The people who ran the workhouses lied. It was easy enough to make the 2 witnesses seem incredulous, and within the law itself, there is a footnote explaining how to get around the family requesting the body for a burial.
A master of a workhouse was indicted for disposing of the dead bodies of some paupers for the purpose of dissection and for gain to himself. On the death of the paupers, he had caused their bodies to be shown to their relatives in coffins, and every appearance of regular funerals to be gone through, whereas just before the funeral, other coffins had been substituted, and the bodies were afterwards taken to an hospital for dissection. The relatives of the deceased persons had not, in accordance with the proviso, required that the bodies should be interred without anatomical examination, but the jury found that the prisoner had caused the appearance of the funerals to be gone through with a view to prevent the relatives making such requirement, and that they would have so required but for the supposed funerals. It was held that as, in fact, the relatives had not made the requirement which under the statute they had a right to make, the master of the workhouse was protected by the statute as a person having the lawful custody of the bodies, and was not therefore guilty of the offence charged.
When the law actually has an example written into it of how the people who benefit from it most can get around it, then it's probably not a very good law. The Anatomy Act was deliberately structured with the intention of harming the poor people in the workhouses, and this is not a new understanding of it either. In the build-up to this law being passed, there was a lot of debate around its intentions, with radical politicians deeply opposing the idea of giving up the poor people's bodies like this. For instance, Henry Hunt had a bit of a different suggestion about where we should get the bodies from.
I would recommend, in the first place, that the bodies of all our kings be dissected, instead of extending 700,000 or 800,000 pounds of the public money for their interment. Next, I would dissect all our hereditary legislators. After that, the bishops, with a host of those priests and vicars who feed themselves and not their flocks. Were there a law passed to this effect, I would willingly consent that my body should be given for the promotion of science.
Honestly, we stand. But despite objections from many people, the law was passed and the poor were the ones who suffered for it. And for all intents and purposes, that is where the story of the Ressurrectionists ends. The anatomists finally had the supply of bodies they needed legitimately. The workhouse masters were able to make a tidy profit. So as far as the government were concerned, everything was sorted. Because to them, the poor were expendable. Throughout every stage of this we've seen, it is the poor who suffered the most. When the medical students couldn't attend their dissections, it was poor patients that they learned on, killing a lot of them on the operating table. The protections for the graves, like booby traps and morgue safes, were exclusively privileges of the rich, so resurrectionists tended to just steal poor bodies. And then the solution to the whole thing was just to turn poor people into property. No matter what happened, the poor suffered, and their bodies were made worthless to protect the interests of the rich. Yeah, that's right. This was a communism video the whole time. Part 5. Morality. He's a lefty. Almost everything about resurrectionism is a product of capitalism. People weren't ripping bodies out of graves and selling them because they'd always dreamed of doing it. They were living in poverty, desperate to make ends meet. It was just an opportunity. It shows what extremes people will go to just to continue living, defiling bodies for their own gain. If you ask me, they're as much victims as anyone. Obviously, I don't condone what they did. Don't go stealing bodies, kids. There's a thing I never thought I'd have to tell the impressionable youth. But they came from a place as impoverished as the bodies that they stole, as impoverished as the bodies that were turned over to stop them. The morality of this is not an easy thing to break down. They were doing evil, villainous deeds, but we understand why they were doing it. Plus there's that whole extra layer of the people who were encouraging them into it, who knew they wouldn't suffer any of the consequences. The anatomists must surely share some of the blame in this. They were the ones who demanded the bodies from the resurrectionists in the first place. No one would have been digging up anything if they hadn't had their petty differences over who got access to the bodies that they had. I found in the research for this a few sources that were quite quick to forgive the anatomists and paint them as unwilling victims of the immoral resurrectionists, which honestly I think is kind of nonsense. They absolutely knew where the bodies were coming from, it just served them better to not care. Famously, one of Burke and Hare's victims, James Wilson, fought back ferociously against them and came in covered in visible injuries. Robert Knox absolutely would have seen this if he had a working pair of eyes at all. He just didn't care. It was for their purposes alone that all of this happened. But again, that's kind of tricky to judge, because if they hadn't had those bodies, a lot of people would have died on the operating table. They needed them. So maybe there is no easy answer to this. Other than respect people's wishes when they die is probably a good start, which is something we still have a bit of a problem with. There was a famous case, Charles Byrne, the Irish giant. He was a very tall man, with some sources saying he was around 8'2", though we now know it was actually closer to 7'7". Because of his massive height, he spent most of his life performing in freak shows, on display for all the world to see. As he grew increasingly ill and knew that he would die soon, he had one simple request: to be buried at sea. He was terrified of the resurrectionists. He didn't want his body to be put on display in his death like it was all throughout his life. So the anatomist John Hunter paid some men to steal his body, he stripped it down to his skeleton, and he put him on display. He only had one thing that he didn't want to happen to his remains when he died, and because an anatomist thought his body was interesting, it happened to him anyway. And he is still there. It is over 200 years later, and his skeleton is still on display in the Hunterian Museum. There have been a lot of campaigns over the years to try and finally get him buried at sea like he wanted, and it does seem like in the past few years his position has actually been under review. And literally on the day that I was doing the bulk of the editing for this video, the BBC put out an article about him, which shows you how much this is still an issue that is being talked about. But for it to take over 2 centuries to get to this point is a failure. Elsewhere, William Burke's skeleton, after his dissection, is still on display at Edinburgh Medical School, which we can presume he probably didn't want. And though there is a certain karmic justice to it, has he not served out his sentence at this point? I don't know. I mean, he's a dead body, it's not like he has any feelings about it. At what point does what a person wanted for their body stop mattering? I just don't know. Conclusion. Body snatching is a frightening thing. It chills to the core and captures the imagination of people who hear it. It would find its way into stories like Mr. Cruncher in A Tale of Two Cities, or the Robert Louis Stevenson short story The Body Snatcher, and its 1945 film adaptation starring my darling Boris. You thought I wouldn't find a way to mention him this year? How you underestimate me. Now, obviously, we can't say for sure that this definitely inspired Mary Shelley in writing Frankenstein. There's no way we can know that one way or the other. But it seems very unlikely that she wouldn't have at least been aware of it. She grew up in both London and Scotland, where it was most prominent, and she spent a lot of time hanging around a graveyard. It's where she learned to read, as well as other things. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that she might have been drawing on it at least subconsciously when she was creating her novel. But then, this video wasn't really about Frankenstein, was it? I was just using that as a jumping off point to talk about an interesting piece of history that I think resonates with where we're at in the world right now. People are still desperate and hurting, and the politicians who ought to be looking after them still view them as expendable. They can't literally sell our bodies anymore. The 1984 Revised Anatomy Act made it so it has to be given up willingly. But make no mistake, they would if they could. In America, you can still sell your blood to make ends meet. And if it weren't for the NHS, I feel like that would definitely be the case here as well. The government does not care about you, and it is only the legal protections that are already in place that is stopping them from doing worse than they already are. Our bodies may not literally be sold to the highest bidder anymore, but capitalism only works by making you sell yourself away. You do all of the work for almost none of the reward. The people at the top view you as all but worthless. We are seeing such concrete proof of that right now as we are months into a global pandemic with infection and death rates higher than at what we thought was the peak. And they are taking away support for workers and making sure that their friends' businesses can stay open. And then in between me performing and editing this, they took away the free school meals for kids during holidays. And I don't know how else to convince you that they're just plain evil. They only care about protecting the hypothetical, made-up idea of the economy, and they will let you risk your life to do it. So long as they keep on making money, you can die for all they care. Halloween isn't fun this year.
He did the mash. He did the monster mash. The monster mash. It was a graveyard.
There seems to be like loose flecks of paint in this skull's eyes. What do you expect from about a dirt cheap thing of bones from the pound shop? Stuart Ashens would be proud. Well, wasn't that all suitably horrifying? Mr. David J. Bradley sincerely hopes that you have enjoyed this production, and would like me now to take a moment to thank his Ghost of Frankenstein patron William Gray, his Son of Frankenstein patrons Chris Harper and Fan the Mothra, and his Bride of Frankenstein patrons whose names are appearing on the screen right now. If you would like to join these kind people in financing this operation, then please head to patreon.com/DavidJBradley, or click the link that appears at the end of this video. I'm told it offers unenviable benefits, such as early access to all these videos, a chance to see the bloopers from these videos, and access to his private Discord server. If you would not care to do such a thing, then you can still help the channel a great deal by liking, commenting, subscribing, or clicking one of the videos that will appear in the link now. With apologies to the estate of Edward Van Sloan.